Greetings, Tsar, Countess Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor here at the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. Today, I have a very interesting topic for you, because it's a topic I've actually broached on my channel before, technically, but not in the way I'm going to talk about it today. I'm talking about the Laibon. I'm diving into a little bit of what is the book, Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom, and its update within the Dark Ages V20 book. Okay, so the big thing here is I've talked about the bloodlines of the Laibon before. Every last one of them I've done a video on. I will mention all of the ones that exist again, and I will say if you want to look into any of these, I have videos on them. They're old, but they're pretty decent in giving the right information. They do a pretty good job of filling you in on each of these individuals, but I will give you like a little bit of the basis here and the summaries of each of them. The thing is, and this is the major thing, is we do not know what happens to the Laibon post the Dark Ages. There is no real confirmation on it. I think the closest thing is there might be something within Beckett's Jihad Diaries, but even then, I can't say for sure. But we should talk about it. So I'm going to start off with talking about what the Laibon is, discussing it, discussing what the members are, which again, I have videos if you want to go check out those individual members, and give you an idea about the Laibon. And then we'll talk about what the Laibon means, what it might mean in the modern age, and reflect upon it a little bit. But there is an important part about talking about the Laibon, and that is when we're coming about and talking about books, there's some things we got to mention about them. So let's show the books off here. So the Ebony Kingdom book is, of course, the original book that introduced a lot of stuff on the Laibons. It was a source book for, look at the bottom, it says a source book for on Africa for Vampire the Masquerade. This was very early 2000s, and I'm not going to say early 2000s was a perfect time when it came to displaying what existed, and especially because it's a Dark Ages book. This isn't modern Africa. This is Dark Ages Africa. This is the 13th century. That's when around Dark Ages vampire takes place. And you can reflect upon how things were going in Africa during the 13th century. Not great. We're getting a lot of European influence in that one, Christian influence, various things in that way. And it is displayed in some information we'll talk about for the Laibon and stuff in some of the other non-members that are also involved with it. But it does mean that when we chat about this, we have to take a lot of that with a grain of salt. And that's why, as much as this is a excellent source for basic information, I'd say a much better source is a lighter book, which we're going to talk about. We'll mention the book in the middle. Of course, there is the Beckett's Jihad Diaries right here. It was after this book, so it was the next book in the line. It does provide some more information about it, probably some more information from a modern perspective. And of course, then, the book that I would recommend the most out of all is definitely the 20th anniversary of Vampire the Dark Ages. This is 2015. It has been 8 years since this came out. But if you're looking for the best information on the Laibon with a generally modern sensibility on how to display things in an appropriate manner that's not insulting to any cultures, or at worst, racist, that's the best way. And again, I don't think anything that was published in any of these was really meant to be it could be culturally insensitive, but it was never meant to be. And that's the thing, is we do have to look at things, because again, the original Kindred of the East, it is 20 years ago. You have to look at it with a bit of a historical sensibility. So, anyway, I do want to show off one thing here, because I talked about the Ashira, and they are connected with the Laibon to a degree. In Egypt, this is their symbol for the Laibon. It does come up in some information, but here, I'll put a bigger one version of it. Here is the symbol for the Laibon as it is displayed in the book. It's in the Dark Ages book. This is not the Laibon symbol for the Laibon. This would be Dark Ages vampires from Europe's symbol that they used to represent the Laibon. Keep that in mind. So the Dark Ages, that's when we get the Laibon. And the vampires of Europe viewed were viewed by the European vampires as a single bloodline, which is inaccurate. There's a lot of different bloods and a lot of different things. The vampires of Africa referred to themselves as the Laibon and saw themselves distinct and different from the European vampires. The term Laibon is the name the African kindred gave for themselves. The thing is, the members of the Laibon were the Legacies. The different bloodlines are known as the Legacies of Laibon. And overall, the Laibon the European kindred knew was, again, just one of the many legacies of it. Now, the thing is, this is an important distinction. We do get a lot of cultural and changes of vampires throughout the world. The New World really didn't have vampires alone, but places like Asia had the Kuai-Jin, which is a separate type of supernatural race, but is kind of associated with vampirism because it is. They're kindred of the East. And yes, the Laibon are in many ways different from your standard kindred. They still are not a supernatural race that's separate from what you find in Europe. So your traditional vampire that you play, Vampire the Masquerade, whether in Dark Ages or in the more actual normal modern, is the same type of creature you're playing as a member of the Laibon, an African vampire. The thing is that's very big about what they do is they ascribe a lot of their origins to African gods and legends, very much different than the Nodist version of things, which distributes things to Cain. There are some similarities. The Laibon, again, Laibon being the name for an African kindred, and for the overall, it's a complex thing, is very similar to Cain. Also, if you are a resident of Africa, which is called the Ebony Kingdom, we'll talk about that in a second here, does not make you a Laibon. A Laibon as a legacy or an individual has a worldview that has its own distinct culture and connection with what's going on in supernatural Africa. A good example is there are some Ventru in Africa, but are more outsiders. The Maiwatu, which are African Cappadocians, have power over the dead. They're considered part of the Laibon because they have a long history in Africa, rather than just be new ones. So, the Ebony Kingdom is, of course, coined by the Laibon. There's 11 lesser kingdoms, each controlled by a Gruhi, who in turn hands their fiefdom to the local Magis, who rule their domain in their name. Most Laibon have no idea their current king is, and an entire ownership of the kingdom can change without notice. Kings can banish Magaji. I'm going to butcher some of these names, so apologies if I butcher any of these. I butchered these probably long ago. If they invoke desire. So, rulership in the Ebony Kingdom, which is basically the organization of the Laibon and the Legacies to a degree within Africa, is a confusing job. Domains are fractured, overlapping. There could be an area that two Magaji rule over without noticing. So there's a lot of fluid borders too with the Gruhi kings. And it's meant to represent a lot of the territory of sub-Saharan Africa continent, is a lot of what the Ebony Kingdom is. So that's kind of focusing on that there for a second. Now, Another difference, though, between your average Kindred and the Laibon is they do not follow the path of humanity, nor the path of enlightenment. So they don't follow what either of the major factions, the Camarilla or the Sabbat, follow. They actually forge their lives about two basically separate paths of morality. Aye, which is the morality towards humankind, and Orun, which is the morality towards the supernatural. And the balancing of the morality between these two things is the path they follow. And depending on where they stand on these two scales is what affects their appearance and supernatural powers to a degree. It's very similar to having things of the path you're on affecting you and the way you work. And this is the fundamental difference that does separate a Laibon, an African vampire, from a typical Canine. So, as I mentioned, the major group here is the Legacies. They're as close to a clan or a bloodline that is within the Laibon. There are a bunch of major and minor ones, and also some others that are within the African continent that you would consider. But again, we're all talking Dark Ages and around the 13th century. This is before major European colonies. There's some European colonization, just not a lot at this point in time. There is connections to some of these legacies that they descended from a parent clan, but it's not necessary that they did. The parent clan idea is like there's a connection there, and whether or not that's an actual connection is just sort of like it's a very similarity. So it's the concept of the parent clan exists. So I will mention them, but you know. It doesn't have the same social niche as its parent clan, even if it's thought to descend from that parent clan. Which begs to differ than, like, a lot of these do have connections, some of them don't, but it becomes a little muddled because, again, different reasoning behind origins and stuff, too. Vampires, as they are believed within especially something like European/Canite legacy, would believe to have originated from somewhere around the Middle East, honestly. You know, closer to that region. That's where Cain would have been. You know, and that's where a lot of the major flooding kind of things would have occurred, with the first city and such. So there is a very, like, centric that's away from Europe, and then we have connections leading both into Europe and Africa, especially with, you know, places in Northern Africa, you know, that gets into a lot of other stories, but this is Central Africa. Anyway, much like clans, they're divided into these legacies. Each have their own disciplines, weakness, all the different rules that are very similar to a lot of other clans and bloodlines they have. And again, I've talked about these before, so I'm just going to kind of go through a basic review of them so you know them. Kusanase, wanders and storytells, close to nature, connected to Gangrel. Our good friends, the Ministry, aka at this time, followers of Set, Lord Keepers. Laibons tend to avoid them. The Gruhi, the dominant legacy, the natural rulers, who are connected with Nosferatu. So this is a very interesting thing, that the most dominant legacy is the one that's connected with Nosferatu, where in Europe it's the Ventru and the Sombra, which were very dominant. The Ishtari, who strive to blend in and make themselves integral to Laibon society, connected to Toreador. The Kinyoni, travelers who attain items or carry out tasks for other Laibons, connected to Ravnos. The Nagloppers, monsters of rumor or myth, connected to Semiche. The Usebo, passionate creatures with a heated temper, connected to Bruja. The Shango, fearsome warriors and sorcerers, connected to Assamites. The Dundu, self-professed lords of the night, connected to Losambre. Those are the major legacies, and there are some minor legacies. And you can see, one of the legacies in Africa is a vampire clan in other places. So they're both a legacy, the Ministry, aka, again, at the time, followers of Set. I'll use Ministry, it's the modern name for them. But the Ministry, at this time, had connections throughout Africa, some in Europe, some in the Middle East, They had a very widespread net. They didn't have a huge power basis, but they had a lot of places they were in, and so they were even within the Laibon. So some other minor legacies and outsider clans that do have their presence, especially during this time period in the Ebony Kingdoms in basically the 13th century. The Malkavians, shunned for madness, blamed by the Laibon for demonic possession. The Miyawatu, necromancers descended from the Cappadocians. The Nukulu Zao, the souls of dead Zao Lat, connected to Salubre. The Ventru, who during this time began to compete with the native Guruhi for dominance over Africa, which, honestly, we're going to talk about the modern day version. Like, modern day as it could theoretically exist, because we don't hear about it. The Bon Sam, a Dark Ages legacy that was territorial, vicious hunters, that would be known to spawn the Akuna Nase and Nargaloper legacies. So the Bon Sam basically spawned a couple of other legacies. The Mpundula Dulu, I'm again butchering some of these a bit. A group of necromancers bound to a coven of mortal witches, and the Ramanga, a legacy that became the Z Dundu. So some of these are more extinct ones too. But that's kind of where the Laibon, which is, again, this interesting thing, the legacies. The Laibon is a multi-use term, because Laibon, again, as we talked about, is the African kindred's name for themselves. They are all Laibon rather than kindred. But it's if you use it by the way that Europeans saw it, they saw it as the Laibon were the group of, like, a single bloodline of African vampires that were power of it. So there is multiple uses of the term that can be seen as honestly a bad use of the name Laibon, because it's European vampires during the Dark Ages were using it. They were using it incorrectly, technically. So, the vampires of Africa, maybe that's what we should call them, The term should be used that way. The legacies of these vampires. Because, again, that's what their group is. The legacies of Laibon. The legacies of the African vampires. The groups of them. Okay. Let's hit the nail on the head here for talking about a little bit about this. We don't know what happens to these. I looked into it here and there, and there is no modern equivalent in literature that's talked about that I've really been able to discover very easily. Not to mean that there couldn't be some here. Certainly, like, if I look up Vampire the Masquerade Africa, and look into Africa in the modern days for vampires, we do see that there are still connections to the old groups that would exist. And though they probably lost a lot of power through everything that happened throughout the Middle Ages. And I think that's an important point to look at, is that the Middle Ages, kind of the Dark Ages, did a lot to damage what would be that region. We know for a fact from our own modern world a lot of stuff that's happened in the issues that Africa has because of the European influence, unfortunately. And yes, it's sort of like when you get into the modern day, a lot of the Laibon terms tend to be ignored almost in a little bit, I think. And it becomes kind of like muddled. And what exists there is so little discussion. Certainly we can talk about the various places and locations within Africa and the various countries. I just don't think there's a lot that's actually talked about, unfortunately, in modern times. You know, I put this against a country that tends to be mentioned a lot. Let's give a good country, South Africa. If you look at South Africa, it is mentioned in the Camarilla book, the V5 Camarilla book. That's it. There might be some information in there. But again, we just don't have a lot about what's going on in the Laibon post-Dark Ages, after everything that happened with the European colonization and conquest of Africa, and its eventual breaking apart. What did that mean for vampires that moved in? What did that mean for the vampires that were there? What did that mean for the vampires after the Europeans were taken out? We just don't know a lot. And I think that is a big hole in it. And I think it's one of those things is that there is this legacy of negativity that is certainly associated with the actions of Europeans during this time period. European influence can be seen across the world. In the US, where I live. And it's particularly bad in, honestly, Africa in a lot of ways, because they were very easy to get to. They're just across the Mediterranean. They could sail much easier there, unfortunately. I think it's the thing that we have to almost look at if you want to use what the Laibon would possibly become. Which is something that, like, when we talk about these here, I talk about them as using a lot of this lore and material for your modern day games. I'm not particularly against playing a past version of Vampire. I'm playing Dark Ages. And Dark Ages is fine. It's fun. I do not matter. I like Dark Ages as a setting. But it's not modern Vampire. There is plenty of material for it, but there's also plenty of material for modern, honestly. And I think that's an important kind of thing to reflect upon it. You have to reflect upon the fact that there is this massive amount of baggage that kind of exists with it. So you got to keep that in mind. I am rambling a little bit here with this entire thing. Just a little bit. So, Laibon. We're getting back to it. The people of Africa. The ancient vampires of that region who are connected with the own supernatural beings and essence of the region there to a heavy degree. Whether or not they have these actual connections to the clans, to Cain, to whatever, that's just so unknown. We don't know. And I think it's just an important thing to see the very fact that it should be respected as its own thing. And we do get more of that respect when we come into the 20 Dark Ages. A little bit more than I would think you get in the original. But it is just such a topic of... It's hard to think of how the evolution would be. Because again, the thing about these, they are still powerful vampires. Now, yes, the vampires of Europe are not going to be waging an all-out direct war against them, but you see that it's like the Ventru that are coming in aren't really trying to exterminate, they're warring for dominance. So certainly there is this maybe idea that some of these more parent clans could have taken over, some of the culture could have been destroyed. It's hard to say what's gone about through this, and it's the unfortunate thing of just being there like that. But we are fortunate that we have this idea of where things started, and we can discuss where possibly the Laibon has gone. And I think that's a very interesting part of the entire thing, is where the Laibon has gone. The people of Africa, the vampires of Africa, they are proud. They've got culture that's very interesting, and I would definitely recommend checking out my old videos about it. They're probably not up to my current snuff of, like, you know, skill. I've learned a lot of things in the videos, but I still think they're very informative and tell you a lot about these various groups and educate you on these various legacies. The legacies of Africa are unique, interesting. They're different takes on many of the vampire clans and groups that we know about, and many of the bloodlines, and give us this different view of a lot of things related to them. And I think it's a very interesting view that we can use to reflect upon how things could have very much been different with different developments. And again, it's the thing of, like, different disciplines, different curses, and different origin. So, again, it's the thing that there is information usually about plenty of places in the world. I just, you know, I can find stuff on Egypt a lot easier than I can find stuff on South Africa when it comes to Vampire the Masquerade, or plenty of other countries within the larger thing. Like Northern Africa, where there is a lot more legacies of the Mediterranean and things like Carthage and the Brugia that were there, and, you know, the influence of Rome through the, you know, and the Ventru and other groups that were connected to that, Ventru and La Sombra. That has stuff. But there's this massive region that post Dark Ages Vampire, they just, I don't know if they decided to ignore it, they just didn't ever get to it. It's hard to say, really. But we know that with Dark Age Vampire, when they did the D20 version of it, we did get information on updates on it that were pretty decent at solidifying things about it. But it's like, it's not completely new information is the thing. It's just like, it's information we have and maybe clarifications and stuff like that. It's building upon what was already had. And I think that's one of the things that is kind of regretful, especially because we get the Dark Ages in 2015, that book, and the Vampire 5th edition came out in let's see here, what was the date that you came out? 2018. So, think about that. The Dark Ages book, which brings us back to something that was, you know, put out during one of the tail ends of White Wolf's original run of stuff. We get that. And you are just 3 years away from 5th edition. But they probably are working on that at least a year or two out. Meaning, Onyx Path, who was working on it, probably knows, you know, doesn't have a chance to dive into it, and might be ramping down their vampire material anyway when Dark Ages came out. And I think that's the kind of regrettable thing about it, is if they were ramping it down at that point in time, they can't explore that. they released the main book in 2015. And as much as it's nice to say, well, what about, Africa, the Ebony Kingdom, and the Laibon, the vampires that are there? Well, I'm out in 2015. Unfortunately, because traditional vampire is very Western-centric. And not just, African Western, European, American-centric, in a lot of the ways it's displayed. And especially for Dark Ages, European-centric, that's where they're going to focus first. And I think that's what happened, is 5th edition prevented us from seeing this. But maybe we'll get some things of vampires around the world in 5th edition. I would love for 5th edition to give us some stuff on what's going on in Africa, or honestly, Asia, like with stuff with the Kuai-Jin and stuff, how they're dealing with things like that. I complain about the Inquisition, the Second Inquisition, but I like the core of it. I like the idea about the execution. I hate, but that's the thing, is I like the core idea of it. I just think that they take it to an extreme. But that doesn't mean I couldn't use that in my World of Darkness in a different degree. I could just make it's a threat, but not as much of a threat. It's just like, another thing that's a threat to vampires out there, and a little bit more cautious and stuff like that. And you have to think about things a little bit more and second guess yourself. But it's not this, it's the doom of all things undead. But how would that affect Africa? What's been going on with the Laibon? I think it would be really interesting to bring us, but they might not, because there's been so much issues with 5th edition, and, there's been controversies and stuff, and some of the people behind it have not had the best ideas. They've been they haven't been good on the way they've displayed things a bunch of times, where they just need to sit down and think about things properly. And I just would love for us to revisit this area, to see what's going on, with the Legacies. The Legacies were one of the interesting groups that I didn't know about until I started doing my Bloodlines videos all those years ago. And learning about them, they were really cool and interesting, and had such a great history that I think could be displayed in such interesting ways for games. I would just love for us to know what's going on there. It's a big hole in lore that I think just really cool to fill. But, that's up for you at this point in time. And you can do that on your own. If you want to use the Laibon, the Legacies, those in Africa, go ahead. You can figure out a way to upgrade them to modern. Certainly, it would be understandable that they lost a lot of power, probably lost a lot of individuals to the overall battle against European vampires, and probably that culminated in what happened during the World War I, World War II era. But in becoming countries of their own, I do not think any of these bloodlines, these legacies, would be eliminated. And perhaps in the last century, they've had the chance of a resurgence in their power basis within Africa. Maybe the great kingdoms of the Ebony Kingdom were lost long ago. Their leaders driven out, and one's more European-centric, instilled. And maybe it's their opportunity that they are taking a combination of, the European-centric thing of perhaps Camarilla method, and adding it to a little bit of their traditional method to come up with something on their own, to have a rebirthed kingdom. The Ebony Kingdoms are back, but they're not quite the same as they were. They're just something that is coming back to the old ways, to the old greatness that they once had in their influence over African supernatural culture and strength. That sounds like something that would be very interesting to explore. And as I always say, you can have a lot of dark things in your games. And certainly, World of Darkness is a very dark and dingy and dirty and deadly. And a lot of those D words. There's a lot in the World of Darkness. It's a gritty. That's the way I want to say it. World of Darkness is a very gritty word. So you have it here. Anyway, I think that'll leave us. I've rambled on a little bit about this entire thing, but I'm trying to express my interest in this entire thing. The people of Africa in World of Darkness, in Vampire the Masquerade in particular, are very interesting. I've had other videos where I've brought up parts of it, things like with the in Werewolf the Apocalypse, with the Simba, the Beset of Africa, and their entire thing, and various other changing breeds, and their competitions with Pentax. And the thing is, they're dealing with stuff with the Laibon too. The Laibon doesn't necessarily at peace with any of them. The Laibon's dealing with them, similar to how in Europe and America, vampires sometimes deal with werewolves, sometimes positively, sometimes not. You never know how it's going to end up. Are you the threat the werewolf wants to take care of? Or are there greater threats and you're just in the way? Anyway, so normal streaming schedule, normal. This is going to be, of course, this is up on Twitch live now if you're joining me live, but you can also join me on YouTube afterwards as it goes up a couple days later. Both of those are really great. So hello Twitch, hello YouTube. Anyway, if you're joining me on Twitch, follow would be great. If you're joining me on YouTube, subscription would be the least. You can actually put into the comments there if you've ever used the Laibon in a either Dark Ages game or modern games, the people of Africa. I'm trying to correct my... I'm almost trying to do what the Dark Age vampires are doing. I'm trying to get my language correct. Because, you know, that was like a... It's an easy thing to do what the people, the vampires of Europe did. It's very easy to do that. And to correct your language and to do it right and give justice isn't always easy. That's right. Anyway, so yeah, those are the things. Comment over there about that. How you used the Legacies, connected anything with Laibon. Liking and ringing the bell and all that stuff is great ways to support on YouTube. My normal schedule is tabletop stuff for streaming. Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, early afternoon. Saturdays, usually like around 11 o'clock. A little later today because stuff was canceled. And I could be a little later today. But normally around 11 o'clock, pretty on spot. And usually Vampire the Masquerade and World of Darkness stuff is on Saturday, so check that out if you want to join in those. And if you can't join live, yeah, a few days later, do it on YouTube. I do also, Crimson Queen is my live play of Pathfinder 1st Edition on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Discussing Tabletop, my tabletop discussion show that probably becoming a podcast soon, so I can figure out all the stuff for it. I'll actually make it into a podcast, more than just a sort of podcast. Afternoons around 6 on Saturdays, later on today. My socials. Discord, twitter.com, link below. And, yeah. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed learning about this. I mean, I like talking about the World of Darkness, and I like the possibilities for this. It's a system that is very interesting in its humanity? Maybe that's the best way to think of it. In the very humanity of the system and what's going on in it, it's always very interesting to talk about. Because there is a darkness that makes a lot of people, and there's a system that just brings it out very often and shows it to the world. Anyway, farewell until those next times, and I bid all of you out there a wonderful rest of your day, rest of your afternoon, rest of your week. Until the next time we speak, dive into the world of darkness or another world. I bid you farewell.